If you grew up in the 80s, you probably remember when skateboarding was cool, and if you didn't, well, stick around, we've got some rad memories to share.
Skate or die.
It wasn't just a fun activity or an alternative hobby, it was the thing to do. And for a brief moment, skateboarding wasn't just a subculture, it felt like it was the culture. Even many of the popular kids, the in crowd, were skaters. And if you skated, you weren't just part of some niche group, you were doing what was cool. Speaking of cool, it's 13 degrees outside here in St. Louis with a foot of snow on the ground and another storm on its way. I don't have an indoor spot nearby, so skating is on hold for now, but I've got skating on my mind, and it's got me reminiscing about when I was really getting into it in the 6th grade in 1986. And by the 7th and 8th grades though, it felt like everyone was skating. Skateboarding wasn't just a thing, it was the thing, and it defined what was cool. So yeah, in today's video, we're diving deep into the nostalgia of 80s skateboarding. We'll revisit its impact on pop culture, movies, music videos, TV commercials, the fashion, video games, and then of course the boards themselves. Let's take a trip back to when skateboarding ruled the world. All right, here we go. In 2023, I visited the Skateboarding Hall of Fame and Museum in Simi, California, and it felt like stepping back in time. Todd Huber, the museum's founder and curator, gave me a personal tour and mentioned how popular the 80s stuff is.
Most people that come in are like you, go straight for the back to the neon. The Hosoi, the white with the pink, or the black Tony Hawk. Or the left, I mean, any of those.
Yeah. The 80s section was a treasure trove of skate history, packed with so many iconic decks from back in the day. Seeing them brought back a flood of memories, boards that my friends had and ones that I saw in magazines. Todd's dedication to preserving skateboarding's legacy made the visit unforgettable and reminded me just how special that era was for skaters everywhere.
It's so rad, yeah.
From my perspective, 1987 was the peak. Skateboarding had exploded into mainstream culture. You couldn't go anywhere without seeing skate decks, launch ramps, and kids decked out in neon skate gear. It wasn't just an activity, it was an identity. Vision streetwear shoes were practically standard issue, paired with a Powell Peralta t-shirt, maybe some Gotcha or OP shorts, and Skidz pants. Top it off with a painter's cap and Tony Hawk's iconic flop haircut, and you had the ultimate uniform of the era. It felt like pro quality skateboards were sold everywhere, even in sporting goods stores and shopping malls. Remember the scene in Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure? That's how mainstream it was. If you weren't building ramps in your driveway, skating in parking lots, or hitting up the ditches with your friends, you were missing out. Skateboarding had truly become a cultural phenomenon by 1987, with brands like Powell Peralta, Vision, and Santa Cruz dominating the scene. Some teenage pro skaters like Tony Hawk were making upwards of $10,000 a month through prizes and sponsorships, a testament to how big skateboarding had gotten. No trip down memory lane would be complete without talking about the skateboards themselves. Back then, your board wasn't just a piece of equipment, it was a statement. And within most skate crews, there were two camps, Tony Hawk or Christian Hosoi. Hawk's Powell Peralta decks and Hosoi hammerheads were legendary. They were so popular that they were almost like gateway boards. Many of you started with one of those, but as you got deeper into the skate scene, you moved on to other iconic decks. Take Kevin Staab's Pirate deck, for example, with its bold graphics and that iconic pirate theme. It's easily one of the most memorable designs of the era. It stood out from the pack and made a statement all of its own. And then we've got decks like the Vision Gator, Mark Gonzalez, Nadas Kappa's Panther, and then all the various versions of Steve Caballero's Dragon artwork. They were all classics that you'd see in any serious skate crew. And speaking of classics, I still have my very first legit skateboard, this Vision Gator here, and it's one of my most prized possessions from back in the day. And I just want to say that I know what Mark Rogowski did and how his actions have tarnished the legacy of this deck. And what he did was terrible, there's no doubt about it. But for me, this particular board isn't about him, it's about the memories tied to it, the ramps that I built, the tricks that I learned, and then the hours that I spent skating on this thing with my friends. What was your first skateboard? Let me know in the comments, I'd love to hear about it. Not every kid in the 80s started out with a pro quality deck. For many of us, the journey began with a Nash or a Veriflex board, the kind that you'd find at Kmart or Sears. These were the affordable entry-level boards that got you rolling, even if they didn't exactly scream performance. The plastic trucks, oversized wheels, and questionable graphics didn't win any points at the skate spots, but they were often the gateway to something greater. For a lot of kids, it was a Nash Executioner, or maybe it was a Veriflex Ramp Rat that introduced them to skateboarding. And sure, they were heavy and clunky, but they were yours and they gave you your first taste of freedom on 4 wheels. If you're feeling nostalgic for those days, you've got to check out the Cheap Skateboarding Museum on Instagram. It's a goldmine of all the boards we love to hate, or the ones even that we secretly loved, from those infamous Nash decks to the rare gems from department store brands. It's a walk down memory lane for anyone who ever stepped onto one of those classics. And while we're on the topic of nostalgia, let me tell you about an Instagram account called Past Participle. It's a treasure trove of raw, unpolished photos from average non-pro skaters from the 80s. And these are user-submitted photos of real-life skate moments, crew shots with kids proudly holding up their boards, action shots of first ollies, and plenty of homemade ramps that were crappy but loved. It's an authentic look at the grassroots side of skateboarding and a must-follow for anyone who lived it or who wants to see how it really was. And then there was Hollywood. Movies like Gleaming the Cube with Christian Slater and Thrashin with Josh Brolin weren't just skate movies. They were part of a larger wave that brought skateboarding into the mainstream spotlight. My friends and I frequently rented the well-worn VHS copies from our local video store, rewinding the best scenes until the tapes practically wore out. And skateboarding just wasn't limited to skate movies. It showed up everywhere, like Marty McFly's iconic skateboard scenes in Back to the Future, and Police Academy 4, where David Spade and the Bones Brigade lit up the screen. But it wasn't just in movies. Skateboarding was everywhere. Music videos, TV commercials, and even celebrity culture embraced it. Tom Petty's Free Fallin' featured skaters tearing it up on a mini ramp. Remember that iconic Beastie Boys photo with them holding up their License to Ill Vision model? And oh yeah, who can forget that kid from REM's It's the End of the World as We Know It, doing hand plants in that old abandoned house, and Suicidal Tendencies went all out with Possessed to Skate, a full-on tribute to the culture. Even NXS gave skateboarding a nod, featuring the Vision Psycho Stick on the cover of their Kick album. And TV stars like Mark Paul Gosselaar from Saved by the Bell were photographed with skateboards, proving just how deeply skateboarding had embedded itself into 80s pop culture. I could go on, but of course we can't talk about 80s skateboarding without mentioning the Bones Brigade. Their videos, like The Search for Animal Chin, were more than just skate footage. They were guides to life. These weren't just tricks on film. They were fuel for our inspiration. They introduced us to skaters like Tony Hawk, Rodney Mullen, and Lance Mountain, showing us what was possible on a skateboard and giving us heroes to look up to. If you didn't know the Bones Brigade, were you even skating? Now let's talk about the gear. In the 80s, it wasn't just about having a rad deck. It was about customizing it with all the extras. Tailbones, rails, nose guards, copers and lappers were everywhere. At first, kids would load up their boards to keep them pristine. After all, you wanted to protect those beautiful graphics. Tailbones ran along the bottom of the deck to stop the tail from wearing down, and copers snapped onto the trucks to prevent grinding damage. The rails on the sides made sliding smoother, and they gave you something to kind of grab onto. Nose guards were like little shields for the front of your deck, and then lappers, those were the curved little plastic pieces that attached to the base of the truck, and they prevented you from hanging up when you were coming back into a ramp after doing tricks like disasters. And they were practical for vert skating, but let's be honest, they weren't exactly the coolest accessory otherwise. But here's the thing, once you got serious about skating, you quickly realized that all those accessories added unnecessary weight and affected performance. Tailbones made it a little harder to ollie, copers made grinds feel awkward, and eventually it just wasn't cool to keep them on, so one by one they got ditched, leaving boards stripped down to the essentials. And let's not forget the safety gear. The Rector knee pads were so iconic. The red and blue ones with the yellow backs. Sure, they were a bit bulky, but when you were hitting ramps or vert, they were a must-have, and bonus points if you could pull off a stylish knee slide after bailing on a trick. What about you? Did you start out with your board fully decked out in accessories only to rip them off once you got more into it? Or were you repping the minimalist look from the start? And how many of you proudly rocked those Rector pads while hitting the ramps? Drop your thoughts down below. For those of us who couldn't always be outside skating, video games brought the thrill of the skate park to the screen. Remember going to the arcade and seeing 720 with its iconic spinball controller? That game was so ahead of its time. I can still feel the adrenaline rush of trying to escape the swarm of killer bees after failing to skate or die. And then back at home on the NES, you had to have a copy of Skate or Die. Sure, the gameplay was clunky, and no, that guy in the skate shop wasn't Rodney Dangerfield, but he sure looked like him. It might not have been the best game, but I spent hours on it anyway. Such great memories. But trends are trends, and by 1989, skateboarding's popularity was waning. The colorful neon era was giving way to the grittier underground vibe of the 90s. The industry struggled, and many of the pros who were household names in the 80s barely scraped by in the 90s. For those of us who stuck with it, skateboarding never stopped being cool. It wasn't just about ollies and kickflips, it was about freedom, rebellion, and carving out your own space in the world. What do you remember most about skateboarding in the 80s? Did you have a favorite trick, a go-to brand, or a crew that you skated with? Maybe you were one of those kids that rocked a Thrasher t-shirt but barely touched a board. We won't judge. Drop a comment below and let's keep the conversation going. Oh, and before we wrap up, you might be wondering about this little diorama behind me. It's a project that I've been working on for a while, a miniature 80s skate shop, and I've been building these custom little fingerboards for it, and it's getting close, so consider this your sneak peek. I've got a few finishing touches to add, mostly some 3D printed accessories, but unfortunately my printer's been acting up and I haven't had time to troubleshoot it yet. But stay tuned because I'll be making a video about all of this really soon. In the meantime, thanks for hanging out with me and taking this trip down memory lane. Don't forget to drop a comment with your favorite 80s skateboard memories. Hit the like button and subscribe if you haven't already. Until next time, keep shredding on or off the board, and we'll see you in the next video.